New America would like to welcome you to our virtual event. The program will begin momentarily. While we are waiting, I want to review a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and a recording will be posted to the New America events page within 48 hours after the event. Attendees will be in listen-only mode, and you will not be able to be seen or heard by your fellow attendees or panelists. Therefore, we encourage you to share your comments and questions in the Q&A and chat features, which can be found at the bottom of the screen. Thank you for joining us. We will begin momentarily. New America would like to welcome you to our virtual event. The program will begin momentarily. While we are waiting, I want to review a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and a recording will be posted to the New America events page within 48 hours after the event. Attendees will be in listen-only mode, and you will not be able to be seen or heard by your fellow attendees or panelists. Therefore, we encourage you to share your comments and questions in the Q&A and chat features, which can be found at the bottom of the screen. Thank you for joining us. We will begin momentarily.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Molly Martin. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the director of New America Indianapolis. New America is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., but I make my home here in Indiana, and this is where I lead work on the Midwest, including on racial equity and economic progress. I want to welcome you to Transforming the Polls in Indiana, a special series that we've been doing with the ACLU of Indiana on Yes, You Can Vote, looking at voter protections and voting rights issues that affect different groups of Hoosiers. Today, we'll be discussing the work of local leaders, residents, and activists to ensure that transgender Hoosiers are safe and empowered at the polls, and what we can learn about protecting and engaging all voters and transgender voters that we can apply here in Indiana and across the country. We'll also be hearing about how transgender leaders are influencing politics and communities across the state. We'll be starting with some stage setting and some education, but tonight is meant to be conversational. So I hope you'll join us online using the hashtag #TransformThePolls or over in the chat where we'll be taking your questions directly to the panel. First, I want to thank my panelists tonight and also thank our partners at the ACLU of Indiana. I'm going to offer a brief introduction to my three fabulous co-stars, and then we'll start off with Kit Malone for some remarks. But first, I want to introduce everyone. Kimberly Acoff is a trans woman and military veteran. She's the programming director at Indiana Youth Group in Indianapolis. She served 30 years with the state of Indiana, working with the Department of Child Services and Family and Social Services, addressing issues surrounding the care of individuals with physical and mental health disabilities. Kit Malone is an advocate and educator at the ACLU of Indiana, where she organizes a statewide public outreach campaign to identify transgender activists and arm them with the tools to educate and engage their communities on the importance of passing comprehensive civil rights protections for all Hoosiers. This is after a successful career working in public education as a high school teacher. She joined Freedom Indiana in 2016 as a community organizer. You might remember Freedom Indiana's work following the RFRA action here in the state. Veronica Petrol began beginning her first year of service representing Greencastle, Indiana. She's on the city council representing the 3rd Ward. This is her first term. It began in January. She was Indiana's first openly transgender elected official. Greencastle's 3rd Ward is an economically diverse place here near DePaul University, where Veronica is also a professor. She works for greater access to shelter and nutrition for the city's disadvantaged populations. Being an active member of the local NAACP and an alumna of Princeton's Graduate School of Music, she has a million credentials and is offering a lot to her community, where she also is active in her church. And if I'm not mistaken, is a proud parent of not 1, but 2 Purdue graduates. She's lived in Greencastle for 15 years. So I'm really excited to have these 3 women with me tonight, and I can't wait to get started. Now, Kit, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to have you do some stage setting for me. Tell me a little bit about yourself, a little bit about the ACLU of Indiana, and why we started this conversation about Yes, You Can Vote in the first place. Kit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that great introduction, Molly. I lead the LGBTQ rights project at the ACLU of Indiana, which is sort of a multi-headed attempt to push the conversation forward on LGBTQ rights in Indiana. The ACLU has a long history of being a leader in that space. We were, of course, the organization that brought gay marriage to Indiana before it was actually found at the Supreme Court nationwide. And we have a long history of being involved in RFRA. We were, of course, one of the partners of Freedom Indiana, my former employer. So I've done a lot of work throughout the state organizing LGBTQ issues, and then I came over to the ACLU with my director, Katie Blair, and she really envisioned expanding the ACLU into something that could be unlike sort of campaigns like Freedom Indiana, which were great but short-lived because they only existed as long as there was an event that people were responding to. We saw the need for there to be something that was in Indiana year-round, somebody that had the ability to, for instance, lobby, because we face yearly attacks in our legislature on the rights of LGBTQ Hoosiers, particularly transgender people. Underneath that LGBTQ rights project, we also have the program that I'm really sort of my baby, the TEAP program. It stands for Transgender Education and Advocacy Project, which is a project to identify transgender advocates throughout the state and teach them how to really do the work of community organizing, and to partner with them in order to provide them with tools and resources and to lift their microphone, to increase the volume on their microphone, if you will, in all the ways that we can, and to prepare them, and then also to bring them in and introduce them to their lawmakers and to give them the opportunity to show Indiana that trans people are not just a thing of downtown Indianapolis or the safe blue cities, but that there are trans people throughout the state, in every city and town in Indiana, who have interests in government, have interests in their rights, and have interests in being part of our cultural conversation in this state. So anything that we can do to lift up their voices, because I think they're hidden. We hear a lot of lawmakers will still tell us, well, we don't have that in Indiana. And I can assure you that you have it in your town. And some of the funnest parts of my life have been introducing a lawmaker to someone who lives in their hometown who is transgender. And that work really changes minds too. That work is one of our most effective tools in protecting trans people in Indiana from those sorts of yearly attacks. So last, I want to talk about voting. That's what we're here to talk about. We have been, for the past 3 years at the ACLU, we have run a campaign called Yes, You Can Vote. Yes, You Can Vote identifies groups of Hoosiers who may find that their voter rights are either suppressed or they may be victims of misinformation about their rights. So we chose through research, the people who we think may be most harmed by these forms of voter suppression. The centerpiece is folks who are previously incarcerated. And I'm going to list some groups of people, but it's important for the audience to understand, I think, that those aren't distinct groups. Like all the groups that I'm going to list all belong to one another. So we talk about the voting rights of people who are previously incarcerated in Indiana, because they do have voting rights. Indiana does not strip people who have a record of incarceration of their right to vote. And we're one of the few states that doesn't. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't know that, which by either purposeful misinformation or simple ignorance. We have heard stories of even judges or parole officers telling people upon release that they had lost their right to vote when that is not in fact true. So it's really important. We have those billboards up around the state. We've got commercials going, and we've worked with so many great community organizations to distribute literature, especially reentry organizations. I'm really proud of that work. And of course, incarceration is something that trans people care about because trans people in Indiana are incarcerated at higher rates than the rest of the population. Which is even worse for many of these groups if you happen to be, a Hoosier who is trans, who is not white. We find that can vastly increase your risk of being a victim of things like incarceration. So we also talk about folks with disability. Lots of trans people have disability of all kinds, and it's important that people with disability know that they have the right to get assistance at the polls. They have the right to bring someone with them if they feel like they need a helper. That is their right in Indiana. They also have the right to expect that their polling location is going to be accessible. Another thing that we need folks to know, that they have the right to that, and that they should report that if they find that their location isn't accessible, because it's important that everyone get that chance to exercise their right. We talk about students, people who, for instance, may find that they're not sure where they should cast their vote. Do I cast it from where I live, which is on campus? That's where I live. That's the town I consider my home. Do I cast my vote there, or do I have to cast my vote where my parents live? And of course, the answer is you cast your vote, you register to vote in the district that you consider your home. The only requirement in order to vote is that you are registered in the district that you call home, that you've resided there for 30 days, and that you have an ID that matches the name on your voter registration. So also with students, another wonky issue is that you can register to vote when you're 17, believe it or not, as long as you will be able to vote, of age to vote, 18, by the date of the next general election. Of course, the registration for this year is already passed, but in the future, know that if you're raring to go, register as soon as you can. You can register when you're 17, as long as you'll be able to vote by the next general election. Finally, and we'll also talk about recently naturalized immigrants who have the right to vote. And of course, we know that every citizen has the right to vote. However, there are special concerns for people who've been recently naturalized. So making sure that they know that voting isn't something that can be used against them if they have family that is undocumented, that as soon as they become citizens, they can register to vote and get out there and vote. They should do that because policies are being decided that affect them. And they have the right to do that. And we should all exercise those rights that we have. And then finally, really finally this time, I want to talk about trans people, which is what we're here to talk about. And, trans people can experience all of those issues that I mentioned in the past. But we also have some special issues of our own at the polls. We talk about safety for trans people, for instance, what it might be like to be trans to vote in, for instance, a rural district where you may have to go into a conservative church basement to cast your vote if that's the polling place, and what you can do in order to be safe. And we also talk a lot about ID and voter ID, which has been a hot topic for trans people in Indiana specifically, because we've faced several attacks on our rights to change our ID over the past several years. It is important that trans people know that they have the right to vote regardless of whether or not they've changed their ID. No matter what they look like, no matter what they think is the poll workers are going to say, you do actually have the right to vote. All you are required by law is to have a valid ID with an expiration date and your current name that matches what is on your voter registration. So if your voter registration matches what's on your photo ID, then yes, you can vote. And if it doesn't, it's change it right away if you can. If your ID does not match, you may have to find yourself casting a provisional ballot, which can complicate things. So if you want to be sure your vote is counted, make sure you have an ID that just matches whatever you're currently registered as. That's the only requirement. So I want to thank everybody for being part of this conversation, and just plug my event, Transform the Polls, which is happening on Thursday. Hashtag Transform the Polls is an ACLU of Indiana initiative to highlight the stories of trans voters. It's kind of a bittersweet year for me because usually this is an in-person event. Usually we take groups of folks all over the state and cities. This year we're doing Muncie, South Bend, Indianapolis, Bloomington, and Evansville. I think I got them all. Yeah, that's all of them. And we have groups of people who will be highlighting stories. In outside of the time of the pandemic, we would be taking groups of people to actually vote together as one to talk about safety in numbers. And if you're nervous about voting at your local polling place, here's a way you can vote with a group of people on an early voting day. This year, it's going to be a lot more about highlighting the importance of using that vote and how you can do so safely during the time of COVID. And so watch the ACLU of Indiana's social media feed on October 23rd. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You will see so many beautiful faces of people voting. Every year we have a couple of folks who it's the very first year they've ever voted, either at all or ever voted with their accurate name and gender. And that always feels like it's such a warm fuzzy that I look forward to every year. And I'm excited about it. So that's the ACLU spiel for y'all. Thank you for sitting through that. I appreciate you.
You must be doing that in your sleep. I have heard there's an election coming up, but that was wonderful, Kitten. Thank you. And thank you for highlighting the importance of feeling safe at the polls. It is one thing to know that you have a power and a right, and it's another thing to feel that you will be personally safe, physically safe, emotionally safe, and able to vote when you get there. So speaking of able to vote when you get there, I think something really compelling about Transform the Polls are voter stories. And by way of introduction to the rest of our panel, I'd love to hear a little bit about your own voting stories. So Veronica Petrol, I'm going to come to you. If you could reintroduce yourself to our audience and share with me a voting story, especially a story about kind of voting as you, as your authentic self. Veronica?
Sure. Thanks, Molly. I'm actually going to share two brief voting stories because I think both of them are really important right now. The first time I had the opportunity to vote as my most authentic self was back in the 2008 general election. And I had legally changed my name earlier that year. I had, just thinking about some of the things that Kit was mentioning regarding challenges to our identities and the authenticity of our identities, I had to visit 3 different BMV locations in the state of Indiana to with my doctor's paperwork to get my driver's license properly amended to reflect my sex. And on the third time was the charm there, but I had affirming ID, thankfully, when I went into that polling place there back in November of 2008, which many of us fondly look back on as a very consequential election in our lives. These were the days, at least in my county, where we were using traditional polling places, which were often located in churches and schools. In my precinct, the polling place that I was to go to was a Baptist church a few blocks from where I live. And I've never been this was my first time in a Baptist church. And so I'm like, I feel awkward going in there for sure. But I've thankfully faced no challenges in that space and promptly went through the motions and cast the vote of my choice. Leaving that space, what felt super empowering. I can't begin to verbalize what the amount of joy that day felt like. The other voting story I have to share, because I brought my sticker with me today, and this is a sticker I've been holding on to since last fall, because this is the sticker that I got to bring to the polling place. We use polling centers now in Putnam County here in rural Indiana. So we go to the courthouse to do early voting, which I did then. But I got this sticker when I had the opportunity to vote for myself in a general election. And that for me, I think for our community here in Indiana, means a whole lot. And I will be holding on to this sticker for as long as I live, because it reminds me of just how important that representation is, not just for people who are voting for policy change, voting for the candidates of their choice, but also the importance of the vote and representation at every level, including in public office. So yeah, that's my other story.
That's a smile-inducing story. Spoiler alert, in case you missed the introduction, that Veronica shortly thereafter became Indiana's first openly trans elected official, and we're so glad that she did. I think that sometimes people hear Indiana and they do not assume that there's this legacy of LGBTQ activism and trans activism here in the state. Certainly, I'll admit, I've lived here for 20 years, but even coming from redder places like West Virginia and North Carolina, I didn't think of Indiana as a place where I would find such an interesting journey and such a rich story. Speaking of interesting journeys and rich stories, I'm going to come to Kimberly and ask her to tell us any voting story. But before I say that, Kimberly, I understand you were in the military, and I want to thank you for your service. What branch were you in?
Army National Guard.
Ah, excellent. Well, thank you very much. Well, Kimberly,
Thank you.
I'd love for you to reintroduce yourself and share with us a voting story.
Thank you. I'm Kimberly Akov. I work at Indiana Youth Group as the Director of Programming there. I'm serving youth that are from the ages of 12 to 20. We advocate for them and provide services, wraparound services, case management, and that type of thing. My story with voting as a Black woman, Black trans woman, 2008, like Veronica, was a pivotal moment for me. Not that I faced any real challenges at the polls myself, but my friends, other trans women of colors who had been incarcerated for merely many times just trying to survive. And then there's these urban, what we call the urban newspaper, the word of mouth, and you don't necessarily get educated on when you can or cannot vote. And you don't get the correct information. Many times the incorrect information, erroneous information is given, saying that you just can't vote if you've been arrested or convicted with a felony particularly. So it's important that information is given, correct information is given. So there was friends of mine who thought that they couldn't vote, but we went anyway. I think you have to just show up. You should exercise your right to vote. And if you're told no, try to get that provisional ballot, as Kit spoke of, and challenge that. Don't take no as an answer. That's my antidote for life. No cannot be the answer. We have to push forward and see if there's something, be your own best advocate, and then reach out to places like ACLU and say that you put in a provisional ballot so that they can channel you to the right help and resources and find out if you really can't vote or not, because that's important, especially for trans women of color and anything else, any other race. It is just important for us as Americans to be to exercise that right, because more than ever, laws are being made that affects our population. And and the statistics are just so startling, because like 1 in 13 people of color don't have ID, don't have the proper ID so that they can vote. And and like 1 in 50 compared to 1 in 56 Black individuals, that's a disparaging number, and it's concerning. So I want to make sure that my message is to everyday average women like myself: try to find out if you have the right ID. Get your voter registration card. Do everything that you can do pre-hand, so that you are lessening the chances that that someone's going to create problems for you. Remain calm and try to work through it, okay? And I think if we just work together and we plan ahead, we can get through this together. That's my hope.
I hope so too. That's so important. You talk a lot about, Kimberly, about ID and identity and identification, right? Are two really complicated things. In Indiana, we have fairly strict voter ID laws, which is perhaps a separate webinar. But how can someone, and Kit, I'll start with you. You may be my go-to on this. How can someone get an ID if they don't have one? And can they get one in time for the election if they are registered, but perhaps they've lost their ID or don't have other state-issued identification?
Absolutely. So the best way to do that, I am not an expert at the old BMV. I do what everybody else does and have to Google that up. So feel free to correct me. But the BMV would be your best option. It does. I know it costs less than $20 to get a state ID. So I would consider, if you can, $20 can be a steep lift for some people, which is why it's a problem that we require voter ID. People in poverty deserve to vote too, and to have their civil rights. Of course, the ACLU spoke out against Indiana's voter ID law, and we have a number of times. But this year, of course, it is what it is. And probably your fastest way to do it is to get a state ID from the BMV if you don't already have some kind of ID. There are other types of ID that will work. You can use a military ID. If you possess a military ID, that is valid voter ID. If you possess a passport, you can use that. If you possess a student ID at an accredited Indiana university that has a photo and an expiration date on it that meets the requirements of the Indiana Board of Elections, you can use that as an ID as well. So those are all possible paths.
Great. And Kit, could you repeat the ACLU web address? Because I know you have some great guidance on the website about ID.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find us at www.aclu-in.org. And if you like, I can throw in the chat the link to our Yes, You Can Vote website with a lot of great information and a lot of links out to even more detailed information, but it's got all the basics there.
Perfect. Thank you. So now that we've gotten some of the paperwork out of the way, the idea of voting and participating it's a right, but it's also a very emotional moment. We all feel a certain degree of responsibility for our communities, for our country, and for each other. So Veronica, you mentioned in your bio that Greencastle, Indiana, while located in a fairly rural area, has some economic diversity to it, has some challenges. What made you look around your community where you've now lived for 15 years and said, I need to run for office, I can change this, even despite the fact that I'm sure you knew you were going to have to talk about and make vulnerable some really key points of your identity. What prompted you to run for office?
Well, so making vulnerable parts of my identity, like I had mentioned, I did my voting as my most authentic self back in 2008. So it has been over a decade that I've been living in my community here. Part of being trans and living as one's authentic self, it is a daily task of activism in and of itself. So I'll start with that and point out that almost as a becoming part of my community and being an active and valued member of my community was part of my has been part of my activism. So getting involved and becoming a church pianist, getting involved in working for and giving time to causes in my community. These are all opportunities to increase visibility of trans folks in my community. And I think all three of us can affirm that simply living and being visible and representing in our communities is part of our activism. Going out and teaching is part of my activism. I don't do it quite as much as I do, and I still do it over Zoom. I teach piano to kids in my community, and I do it on a pretty cheap scale, so that folks in the community get an opportunity for their kids to have that experience, right? So that was part of everything before I ever thought about getting into politics and representation in the community here. The third ward in Greencastle is a long and narrow, I won't say gerrymandered, but it is an oddly shaped ward that extends both over an area that's densely populated by some of DePauw's faculty and staff, as well as a more transient community and a renters community on the east side that includes folks who and children who suffer from food insecurity, housing insecurity. We do have a not inconsequential homeless population here in Greencastle. We do have a women's shelter, but we do not have a homeless shelter that can take men. We are working on some of these issues here in Greencastle. So there is always unfinished business to be done. And some of the things are obvious when you look around and you see cars in the Walmart parking lot that are have pillows and bedding in them from folks who have been challenged with regards to housing. So that's that. But there's also other challenges that are not quite so visible. The challenges of addiction in our community, folks who are suffering from addiction, folks who are challenged with mental illness in our community. And during these pandemic times, this is even more amplified for disadvantaged folks. So all of these sorts of things were factors that when unfortunately, the prior counselor for the third ward announced that he was not going to be running again because he was suffering from terminal cancer. Folks reached out to me and asked if I would consider running, and I, said I would. I was very, very thankful to have a community that stood behind me and supported me and our message of good neighborliness in Greencastle. But that's not a message that necessarily people just did on their own. It's a culture that I hope to think that by those 12 years of authentic living in my community and representing as a productive and valuable citizen of our town, that value comes back, and so I am always a big advocate of partnering with allies who can mutually benefit from each other. The woman who helped me the most by providing organizing space, community organizing space for my election campaign last fall, and helped with being my canvassing manager, is a mom to a trans kid who at the time was 7 years old. And fighting for her was a big part of reminding myself why I was doing what I was doing, because her life is in the balance too, especially with another consequential election ahead of us this year. So the work I do is for our community and for the disadvantaged folks here. And, you know, Kit's mentioned so many different tiers of folks who are marginalized with regards to voting, including homeless folks, and folks here in Greencastle need to know that they can vote. We're doing a pretty good job of reaching out to the formerly incarcerated community here in Putnam County. We need to do better still in terms of some of these other communities as well. So yeah, I hope that answered your question, Molly.
It more than answered it. And it's so important, I think, to hear that obviously, and I'm speaking a bit out of turn here, being a trans woman is an important identity. It is kind of a political act in and of itself. You also have all kinds of political interests and passions and needs and priorities as community members. And telling your story of kind of living and being an activist in a rural area is a story that I think a lot of people in rural America would find really resonant. That makes so much sense.
And if I can bounce back off that briefly, you had mentioned who would think in Indiana. It actually turns out that Illinois, our neighbor to the west, which folks generally think is a bluer place, has not yet elected its first transgender elected official, although we do expect that to happen with Judge Jill this fall, who I'm blessed to have had an opportunity to meet this summer.
Wonderful. That's great news.
Also, might I add, in your face, Illinois.
We're number one. We're number one. We can take on Wisconsin later too. I love this. So something that Veronica said really left out to me, Kimberly. She said, the woman who made the biggest difference. So I don't mean to put you on the spot here, Kimberly, but your name comes up a lot when people talk about someone who made a difference in their personal life, their political life. So I hope you know that. But I'd also love to hear from you, Kimberly, as you look around your community, what makes you get up every day and decide to be an advocate, an ally, and kind of a den mother and leader for lots of young folks here in the city? I'd love to hear more about that.
Thank you. That's good to know. Thank you for saying that. Really, what makes me get up every day and what has made me get up for the last 30 years is the young people, because they're our future. I feel blessed to work with them every day. I feel blessed that they're here right in America. They're going to be our future governors, presidents, representatives, nurses, doctors, and caretakers. They're going to be our frontline activists. So educating them and lifting their voices, amplifying their voices, and making sure that we are building futures that are going to better their tomorrow is immensely important to me. As a young person, so many years ago, I had a trans woman that came out and gave me shelter. When I didn't have it, when I was put out. So I learned from that. I learned to be caring and giving and loving in spite of what I might meet on the opposite side of, of that love. And I also believe in America. I believe in the power that we can come together and find common ground to make sure that we house the homeless, we give medical care to those who are sick, and we care for our children. That's been what America's been built on. And that's why I continue to fight for, and it's an honor to work for Indiana Youth Group, working for the Department of Child Service, in the state of Indiana, that's always been an honor. I wanted that from the time I was 10, and to actually get to live that out, nothing better. And now to get to work with LGBTQ youth and their allies, I couldn't ask for better. I've hit the lottery because I see young people come in with their shoulders slumped, and I see them walking out the door with their shoulders held high and their heads held high, and there's some pride in that. And when they look at people like myself, Kid and Veronica, and allies like you, Molly, it sends a powerful message that there is hope. And that's what I want them to know, that hope lives. It's not dead. It's not found in someone saying no. It's found in you saying yes to yourselves and finding someone out there who can support you and will believe in you. And I think, you know, us coming together as advocates and speaking out and living our truth and living our authentic selves, we're doing that. And so that's what that's what I wake up for.
Ooh, you're gonna thaw out my think tank iron heart here, Kimberly. That's powerful stuff. So for folks who don't know, could you tell us a little bit about Indiana Youth Group?
I'll be glad to. Thank you. Indiana Youth Group was founded in 1986. It started out as a hotline to prevent suicide, and just for someone to be on the other end of the line for desperate youth. It has just been a lifesaver for many youth in in Marion County, but not only that, it has spread it through virtual program to other counties and even out of the state of Indiana. So it's that beacon of light in all the darkness that LGBT youth can find themselves. It's kind of that lighthouse where you can come, where youth are able to come when they're facing homelessness, when they don't have jobs, when they are bullied in school. We are the voice, we're the advocate. We provide wraparound services for case management, providing food through our pantry, finding housing. We are just now entering a very excited program, Project Prism, where we're finding housing for youth. And we continue to advocate for youth in school through our GSA programs. So it's just so much, and I'm so excited to be a part of it.
Wonderful. Thank you for walking us through. You mentioned in your work, all three of you have mentioned really, that transgender people sometimes have a higher incidence of some of these other social challenges. So they might be housing insecure at a higher rate. There may be problems with employment discrimination, or even accessing employment or getting equal pay. We talked about rates of maybe mental health or addiction, or even increased incarceration, sometimes just by virtue of trying to survive. So in an election year, when you're exercising your power at the polls to make sure that you can make some big policy changes so that these general areas of tension and pain for transgender residents gets lifted a little bit. Let's say I give you a magic wand tomorrow, Kit, and make you the governor. What is the first policy step you take that you think is going to improve the lives of transgender Hoosiers and by extension, improve all of our lives? Take that magic wand.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for making me governor. I accept. I will rule with an iron fist. But what I want to say is that when I think about policy change in Indiana of any kind, I think about how important it is to start with folks most harmed. How advancement doesn't happen. It can't happen by leaving people behind. And it can't happen by being something that only benefits people who may already have a lot of benefits and privilege. And so if I were to get a one-shot change for Indiana, one shot that I get to change something, it would be our overpopulated prison system. It would be deep prison reform. I think that the way and I'm speaking, of course, as Kit, I'm a transgender person, but I do think that when I think of like a keystone issue that keeps the poorest people who are trans and a number of other people, particularly people of color, from building cultural wealth. It's the incredibly high rates of incarceration that you see. I will tell you that affects trans people really specifically because trans people are likely to experience homelessness. And so many people in my social network, including myself, have experienced homelessness as a result of being trans. And this leads to doing work to survive that may not, may not follow the law. And that leads to the collection of felonies, which leads to the inability to get a job, which leads to back into that cycle and feeds that cycle. So if I could do one thing, it would be to stop criminalizing so many people and to provide ways, whether it be expungement, whether it be simply decreasing our mandatory minimum sentences, whether it be decriminalizing certain kinds of behavior or reducing our penalties for them. I would like to see us address our prison system. If you go to the ACL's website and look at our campaign for smart justice, we have identified a number of very small policy changes that could lead to a 50-cent reduction in Indiana's prison population if Indiana lawmakers had the courage to adopt them. It would make us a wealthier, more caring, and more humane state. So there we go. There's my campaign speech.
Well done. We've already got someone coming in the chat, Kit for Governor 2024. So you've got a little bit of backup there. Well, Veronica, from the city council to governor for a day, what do you do?
Oh, well, Kim enumerated so much about focusing on the least privileged amongst us, those of us with the least, and the incarcerated community is clearly one to identify there. I would also draw out the notion of our voter ID laws here in the state of Indiana. I think that is an important target to focus on in terms of voter marginalization and voter suppression within the state of Indiana. And I think that any opportunity to give every Hoosier the opportunity to vote in their communities is always going to be better for our cultural wealth, as Kit put it, in our communities. So I would identify that as well. If I was, there's only so much we can do as city councilors. But if I could put myself in the role of benevolent dictator rather than the iron fister, I would think that also identifying the challenges to access for quality mental health care and addiction recovery care for those in the least or those who are in marginalized communities, that those are two communities that need uplifting and need help from the state, because they're not getting it from anywhere else. And it's time that we identify these communities and uplift them.
Thank you so much, Veronica. So Kimberly, Veronica's out, you're in. Governor for a day. Where do you take us?
Oh, I have such a tough act to follow. My goodness. Haven't been in the military and, coming from a military family. And I would look more to that area. I would lend my voice to fighting against that law that keep trans people from serving in the military, mainly because so many marginalized people don't have the means, either from their family, their parents. Most of us, like myself, I grew up, poor, and my access to education, home, owning a home and getting that first real job that paid anything was through the military. And it is, and when, you know, and serving as a drill sergeant there in the military, I found out that there are a lot of stories that were like mine, of poor people finding that out and the key to some form of success through the military. So the Supreme Court says that a job can't discriminate, but one of our biggest employers in our nation continues to discriminate. So I would advocate for that to be no more. That's not what I would do.
Lofty priorities. I love it. These are great chewy policy points, which we talk a lot about changing the world. These are some specific levers that you can influence by casting your vote. So let's hope and assume that someone watching us right now on YouTube or on Zoom is grappling with the idea of casting their first vote as their authentic selves. You've talked a little bit about your personal voting stories. What is an action plan that you might recommend to somebody in the audience who's getting ready to do this for the first time? I'm going to go in reverse order. So Kimberly, I'm coming right back to you. Give us some counsel. Where should they start?
I say prepare yourself. Make sure you have your ID together. You're pulling all that stuff together. You get your voter's registration card, have that together. And you know what, go over the issues, get excited about it. Know that this is affecting you and everyone behind you and everyone in front of you, that this is your voice in the community. This is your chance to say something, to advocate for yourself, to speak up for your community. It's, you know I've been in many I've been in a couple of marches. I won't say many, I've been in a couple of marches. I think, you know, that is a wonderful way to advocate and put your, and become a, and get your, and, you know, give your input. But more than that, it takes us voting. So that's the biggest muscle in our community that's going to lend itself to you, changing policies and laws. And that's what I say. Get excited about it and get out there and vote.
Great. So step one, get excited. Kit, what's a step two?
Familiarize yourself with your voting options. Know how you can cast your vote. So we've talked about research. Kim talked about researching that candidate and getting excited about the issues, which is definitely your first step. Your second step, I say, would be to choose from the multiple options that you have available to you to vote, and know in advance how you're going to do it. Because in Indiana, we make voting harder than it needs to be. And honestly, our voting laws are stricter than many other states, despite the fact that voter fraud is vanishingly rare. I would tell you that we were disappointed that Governor Holcomb did not heed our call to extend absentee voting to all Hoosiers. We've heard a lot of questions about that, and there's a lot of confusion really about how absentee voting is going to work for people who are afraid that they might contract COVID if they're going to the polls. I would tell you that considering delays in the mail, considering all the things that have been in the mix and the size of this election, it is probably, even though the official due date for ballots is the 22nd, that's this Thursday, it's probably a little too late. Like, I would consider, unless you have already requested that absentee ballot, what I might consider instead as a safer alternative is an early vote. Indiana's early voting period is underway now. It's been underway since the 6th. You can simply go into a voting location and cast your vote in your district. The best way to find out where that is to go to indianavoters.com. And just, they've got wonderful tools for checking your voter registration to make sure you are registered to vote. And they've got tools for learning where you can vote. So hit them up. If you are still confused, you can always just give a ring to your county clerk's office. They'll be able to help you as well. But for most people, that's probably going to be the most accessible way to find out. And that is a state-run website, so it's accurate, and you can count on that information. And they'll probably have the most up-to-date information in case, in this unprecedented election where we have so many people voting, which we're super excited about, but also so many complications because of the pandemic. do check before you walk out the door. Make sure that you know where you're driving to, especially if you have trouble traveling. Lots of trans people, for instance, rely on the bus system, and it might take an hour and a half to get across town to get to where you need to vote. So know it right away. Make sure you double check that you're going to the right place and that they're going to be able to allow you to vote. So yeah, that's mine. That's mine, is do that research first.
Do your homework, absolutely. So Veronica, when I come to you, I'm going to come with two questions in one. The question that I just posed to Kit and to Kimberly, but also, especially as a local official, we've been asked in the chat, thank you, Jason, how can poll workers make voting a safe and positive experience for folks? What can they do? So we want you to do two things, Veronica: speak to a first-time voter and speak to the poll workers about making it a welcoming environment.
Well, addressing the first question, I will plus one Kit's uplifting of indianavoters.com. It's a fantastic resource for every voter in Indiana. It's too late to register, but for the next election, it's a place where you can register if you already have a state issued ID in the state of Indiana. The other thing is the one thing I don't like about indianavoters.com is that the best part of it is through the voter portal, and the button is at the bottom of the page and you have to scroll down to it. That voter portal button should be up front and center on that page, because that's where everyone needs to go, because that's where you can see where your polling place is, what the polling place hours are. You can see who's on your ballot right there in your web browser, so you can go open up new tabs and say, which of these judges do I want to retain, or can I look at those judges records with regards to decisions that they've made that might be impactful on my life. So you're not left flat-footed when you're in the ballot area, and you're a more educated voter, because an educated citizenry, as they say, is the foundation of our democracy, right? So I'll point that out, and then finally add a bit for myself and say, if you're voting for the first time as trans, phone a friend. I think Kit and Kimberly can probably affirm that we've all stood on the shoulders of giants to get to the place of comfort where we are in our lives. There's someone who walked before us, who we look up to as a guiding figure, and I think that all women have that in their lives, and men as well. I think that we all look up to mentors as we develop into ourselves as we grow as adults. So I would say phone that friend and find somebody who's been there before and go with them if you can. Now, the second question, I'm going to have to ask you to repeat it. So,
of course, no, that was an unfair audible that I called. So, how can a poll worker ensure that voting is safe and positive for first timers, for long timers? But how can poll workers contribute to trans safety?
Yeah, and I see that question there from Jason now in the chat. Now that you mention it, first and foremost is as a poll worker is to honor the presentation of folks in front of you. If you, and this not only goes for poll workers, but I think it goes for grocery store clerks, and I think it goes for mail carriers, and everyone else who's in a point of service. And that's to be kind to people who look different than you. And just start there, right? So if someone looks different than you and they bring an ID that might not visually match their if it's a 4-year-old photo and they might have made some substantive cosmetic changes to their appearance, but their name is still an older name because they haven't been through a legal process for that yet. Be kind and honor the process. I think that that would be the valuable message that I would share.
Thank you. That's so helpful, Veronica. Kit, how are poll workers trained? I don't know, to be honest, I don't know if this is something the ACLU gets involved in, but are they given counsel on what to do if confronted with, say, a mismatched ID in terms of just that visual?
Yeah, so I will tell you this, the ACLU every year, we send instructions for interacting with trans people at the polls to every county clerk in the state. We get the occasional response that they appreciate the training. Of course, county clerks are sort of free to determine what the training protocols for their poll workers are. We don't have an official way of knowing exactly what that training looks like. We certainly, haven't yet been asked by a poll worker, by a county clerk to come in and train their workers, although we would if they asked us to. But I will say the tips that we give them are fairly straightforward and also very easy to follow. And I think that people are often instructed, maybe they hear things on the internet and they think this is all very complicated and hard, but like when you look at it, the rules are pretty simple. So what we talk about is, you may encounter people who their identification doesn't look exactly like who they are, or who they're presenting themselves to you as. And the thing that you need in illegally is that if all of their legal requirements are met, they are entitled to their right to vote. Just because they're wearing makeup that day and they're not wearing makeup in their photo, or vice versa, does not change their legal entitlement to vote. Lots of people who are not transgender look very different in their photo IDs. And so you may have had a bad hair day, you may have had a, like a smudge on your nose. You may have had any number of things when you went to the driver's license branch to get that photo taken. Lots of people look different in their photos, and we all know that. I don't know a single person that thinks their driver's license photo accurately sort of represents what they look like. I know I never have, and I still don't. So just kind of knowing that. Hey, also like a certain kind of politeness that you can have that is extendable everywhere is maybe just don't assume that someone is a man or a woman. There's lots of neutral ways to refer to people rather than like sir or ma'am, that don't put people in that position. And honestly, like it's 2020. It's maybe time to deal with the fact that some people, of course, my poll worker tips don't seem so snarky when I send them, but I will say that it's 2020. It's time to realize that people look all kinds of ways. Hey, never use words like it or whatever when referring to someone who's transgender, right? We've heard reports of things like that happening. And if you are concerned about like what to call somebody because it's necessary to refer to them, it's okay to ask. If you don't know and you're about to refer to them, you might want to ask like, what are your pronouns? You notice that we all have our pronouns right here in our Zoom windows, which is super convenient. Not always so easy in person, but that's something that trans people will also see as a sign that you're a safe person, which is important. And hey, it's fair to use someone's first name. Pronouns are placeholders. You can certainly if you just don't know that it doesn't actually matter in terms of whether they have the right to vote. Their gender has no impact on their right to vote. So don't worry about it. Use their first name the way you would use if you were if you were confused. Don't ask people what their real name is. That's weird. Yeah, that's it. And privacy. The last one that I want to hit out of all of these is privacy. You have a risk when a trans person hands you an ID that doesn't match how they're presenting themselves to you. That is an act of trust. That is an act of like deep trust that they're not going to get hate crimed at that moment. And I'm not joking about that. I mean, that, they may, when you hand over that ID, whether it's at the polls or at a bar or in a grocery store, you don't know what the person holding that ID is going to do. They may say something very loud and there may be a whole line of people behind you, and who knows who those people are, and who knows what their opinions are, and who knows how they may feel about you. They may have been fed on a steady diet of hate that they've picked up from the media, and they may want to do you harm. So when you announce that someone is transgender in public because their ID looks different, or when you make a big deal about them, you may find that funny or like may not see what a big deal it is, but you may actually be risking someone's safety or even their life. So yeah, so I definitely want to raise the privacy concern for poll workers. I think that's probably the most key. Lots of people make mistakes, but let's try not to put people at further risk
It's a really important point. Thank you, Jason. So I'm going to go to Kimberly here to see if she has anything to add to that. We have given ourselves a little extra time tonight, so we ostensibly have some more time together. If you have other questions, we'd certainly love to hear them. But Kimberly, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to Jason's question about being a poll worker and making things feel safe.
I think Kit and Veronica said it. I would just add, reiterate, just being kind and loving to each other, and make sure and ensuring that everyone have a pleasant experience.
It's a vulnerable thing to vote, period. It's a vulnerable thing to go into some of these spaces, whether you're going to the city county building, going into maybe the basement of a church where you've never been, and certainly that extension of risk and trust when handing someone your ID is a really important point. So I want to make sure we talk a little bit about how someone watching this from a state where there isn't a Kit, there isn't a Kimberly, there isn't a Veronica, or at least they don't think there is, right? Because we know we have lots of transgender neighbors, but maybe they don't have a role model or a direct connection. I want to know what your advice would be to someone trying to be a role model, find a role model, spark a movement in their own hometown might be. Veronica, what would you say to someone who's watching out there and wants to find a you?
Well, you can look me up on the internet and reach out to me. And I don't care whether you're in Idaho or whether you're in Florida. I am blessed to be very well networked. I will be happy to answer questions. And so I'll start right there. I'm happy to make myself a resource regardless of where someone lives. I'm assuming that if someone is watching this video too, they have access to the interwebs, which of course is replete with misinformation, but it's also replete with great assets. And there are wonderful communities if you can, and just start there. Not every state has a well organized transgender organizational community. Indiana has on and off at times. Right now we're kind of off in terms of just an umbrella trans community organization for the state of Indiana, but there are advocacy groups surely for the youth here in Indiana. Kim can speak more to IYG and the great connections that can provide for folks who are coming to terms with their identity as well. But I'll put it right out there. I have a very unique last name. It's unique enough that I'm one of like 5 people in the nation with this last name. And my twin sons are 2 of those, 2 more of those 5. So Google me and get in touch with me, and I will help you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Kimberly, Veronica teed you up a little bit to talk about youth resources, but generally, what would you say to someone who's watching and wants to inspire or join a network?
Definitely look within your community. And one thing I always say, if there's no one, be it. Stand up or lift your hand and people will show up. Because most often, if you're thinking about it, someone else is thinking about it, but not everyone wants to stand up. But if you stand up, that will encourage and give someone else the courage to stand up and speak out as well and form those groups. And definitely look up IYG. We don't care where you live. We're going to help in any way that we can. So all you got to do is put in the web IYG and it'll in Indianapolis, and you'll find us, and we are going to help you no matter what.
Such a generous offer. Thank you. Kit Malone, what would you say?
Yeah, this is near and dear to my heart because this is the work I do every day. And it's so possible. And like and I want to echo Kim and say, you can be that person. And it's important to me that, I think our culture sometimes leaves us feeling helpless. There's sort of an ingrained helplessness in sort of, I want to be nuanced here, but in the narrative of us being minorities, because we have challenges, and they're real challenges, and I see that every day. But I think sometimes the online culture, the discourse that we engage with in one another, can be very disempowering. And it's important to me to also say, yes, this is real, but also you have power. And you can make change in your community. And we see that in my trans advocacy program, where we have seeded a number of small community groups. Shout out to Queer Space in Evansville, folks who have gone through our trans education and advocacy program who, started doing work in their communities on their own. That sometimes people may need a push. But what I think a lot of people who are trans, who may live in a remote place or may live in a rural area, what they may think is that, well, it's impossible, there's nobody like me here, or I will be chased out of town. I will, I don't want to glad hand you, it is hard to be trans in America, no matter where you live. But I think that you find when you create community, when you offer an opportunity for people to come and join you, people are super excited to do it, like super excited to be part of it. And that's something that's accessible as heck. You don't even need money. You need a public library with a rentable, or excuse me, with a meeting room you can check out, which almost everybody has. Maybe be the person who started that. Put a post up on Facebook, send out the call, and make a space, because it may be scary, but you might be the lifeline for someone else. And you might find that the community that you help to create is your lifeline. And I cannot take credit for creating the community that I find myself in, and that I share with Veronica and Kim. But I know that I've been able to be there to create space, and that those exact same spaces have been the things that have kept me from falling off a cliff. So, hey, creating community is an act of self-care, and you can do it.
I'll tell you, I usually am in the business of having very hopeless conversations. It's kind of, we don't like to think of think tanks that way, but we talk about problems. That's for a living. It's so refreshing to talk about solutions and kind of leading with love. It's been a really special evening for me. So I've noticed that our questions and comments are starting to slow a little. I know it's a busy season for all of you. It is election season, so we're coming up on time. So I think it's a good time to wrap. I'd love to hear a last word from all of you, though. You have a captive audience in the most positive way. We're talking about how to keep transgender voters safe and engaged, and how to empower our transgender neighbors to get active, whether that's politically, personally, religiously, just in their community. And so I'd like to come around and hear a parting message, anything you want about what we've discussed tonight. And please also accept my thanks and New America's deep thanks. And also on behalf of the ACLU of Indiana, their deep thanks for participating tonight. I'm so thrilled, and I'm so grateful to everyone who listened in. Kimberly, I'll start with you. Last word.
My last word is, as it is always, surround yourself with love, extend love, and create a safe space for everyone. That's my last word.
Beautifully put. Thank you, Kimberly. Veronica.
Yeah, I want to bump off the last question briefly, because I think something needed to be said that didn't get said. A lot of our small rural communities actually do have pride groups. And here in Putnam County, we've got Putnam Pride Initiative. Down in Owen County, Spencer Pride has an amazing and huge Pride Festival every year. They're the biggest little Pride Festival in the nation, I think. And so look in your own community, and if there's not something there, like Kit said, make it yourself. Harvey Milk said that you've got to give them hope, and I want each of us watching today, each of us thinking about, maybe running for office, to keep hope alive in your own heart. If you're the parent of a transgender folk, or the sibling of a trans person, or a poll worker, love your neighbor. It's so important to lead with love. And that's something that Kim had mentioned as well. And with that, I'll close.
Thank you, Veronica. Kit.
I'm going to keep the theme. I'm going to take off my also very hard-nosed ACLU mask, because I feel you, Molly. Like it is nice. This space has been really, really, really healing for me, because you spend so much time talking about difficult policy problems and difficult community problems. But I want to raise the love and a lack of love. A lack of love in America is a policy problem. And growing love as a resource is a problem that requires solutions. It requires us to reimagine our politics, and to think about, to get away from our culture of scarcity that we live in, where we sort of, in America, we pick our ground and we say, this is our ground, and nobody can share it with us, and we've got to defend it. And I think that's the core of a lot of the problems that we face, and the core of a lot of the problems that anyone who seems other, who seems like an other to the people in their communities face. And some of these very difficult and thorny political problems that we face, like the way our country discriminates against transgender people, but not limited to that, are absolutely a failure of our culture to value love as a political statement. So I just kind of want to coda on that, that can be something we think about and talk about in very serious places.
Thank you, Kit. I can't think of a better way to wrap up, so I will just do some housekeeping. And again, extend my deep thanks to Kimberly Acoff, Veronica Petrol, and Kit Malone. Thank you to the ACLU of Indiana. Thank you to my colleagues at New America, some of whom are out there listening and helping us make this happen. If you're out there participating in the event tonight, you will receive a message from me with a transcript, a video, and some takeaways from tonight's event. I hope you will share them, and I hope you will spread the word about the voting resources and political participation resources that we talked about. Please also find me online at Molly G. Martin on Twitter, MOLLYGMARTIN, or you can email me at martin@newamerica.org. We'd like to hear from you, and we'd like to have the opportunity to share these resources with you. Most of all, and this is not a partisan statement, vote. Certainly a lot of people have laid themselves on the line to allow you to do it. And if you need resources, need help, or need advice, you can certainly find it from the Indiana ACLU. So again, with deep thanks to everyone joining us out in the audience, everyone watching on YouTube, and certainly to the three fabulous women who made this such a vibrant, loving conversation. Deep thanks. Thanks to all of you. Have a great night. And Kit, I know it's election season. Go take a nap. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.